Welcome back to Cities on Console. Welcome if you're new. Today, we will be diving deep into this week's Dev Diary. This week, of course, we're learning all the details about electricity and water services in Cities Skylines 2. But before getting into the video, I want to ask you to consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and to drop a like if you end up enjoying today's video or finding it informative. And, as always, please also feel free to drop a dislike if not, as any and all engagement is welcome and helps me improve the channel and make more content that you all find helpful, entertaining, and worthwhile. But without further ado, let's get into this week's Dev Diary. So it begins by stating that almost all buildings need electricity and water to function properly, so these services are the components to running a city. For citizens, a lack of electricity or water leads to reduced well-being, with a lack of water and backed up sewage also taking a toll on their health. Don't leave them without these basic necessities for long, as they will not tolerate it and will leave the city. Businesses and service buildings suffer a penalty for their efficiency, leading to reduced production or output and lower quality services. So let's get into how these vital services function. Creating electricity and water networks is different in Cities Skylines 2 compared to its predecessor, as both can now be transferred through roads. While the electricity was transferred by connecting power lines between power plants and electricity zones created around buildings in the original game, buildings now connect to the electricity grid through either above ground or underground cables. Meanwhile, surface water and water pumps work similarly in both games. Cities Skylines 2 introduces a new water mechanic in groundwater reservoirs. So we already looked at this in the video the other day, but I quite like this change with the groundwater reservoirs. It's a little more realistic, as well as the cables actually transmitting electricity underneath the roads, rather than just having these weird electricity zones that were kind of just magical zones that spread electricity in the original game. But getting into electricity production. There are various ways to provide the city with electricity. Electricity can be produced locally in the various power plants. Electricity can also be traded with outside connections through power lines. If there's an electricity deficit, the city automatically buys electricity from the neighboring cities if the city is connected to the power line leading to outside connections. If the city produces excess electricity, it can in turn be sold to outside connections through power line connections. Importing electricity is quite costly, but can help during electricity usage spikes. Exporting electricity can cover the production costs partially. Emergency battery stations and battery upgrades for certain power plants can be used to store excess electricity produced in the city for when the city experiences a spike in electricity usage. So this goes back to something I was mentioning the other day. It sounded like in the early game, maybe it would be feasible to connect to power lines from outside connections. Of course, it is quite costly, as it says here, to import. So there's going to be a surcharge, just like there would be in the real world. You know, there's some kind of tax or tariff or something you have to pay to import any kind of good or service, really. But that cost might be, negligible when compared to spending millions and millions on building your own power plant. So in the early game, I could see this being an option, depending on the map. If you're close to an outside connection, and having some power lines does make it more cost effective than building your own power plant. And it says here it can help during electricity usage spikes, of course. So even, later in the game, if you are producing your own electricity, being able to connect to an outside connection could help you if, just like it says here, if there's a spike in usage, or I don't know if this is a function of the game. I imagine it is. Maybe one of your power plants goes down, or you run out of resources. If you're using, say, a coal power plant, you run out of coal for whatever reason, so you're producing less. I think it could definitely be a lifesaver in certain situations, whether in the early game or the late game, to be able to import electricity from outside connections. And of course, being able to export it as well is massive, because that's just, money you can make all throughout the game by selling off electricity and power services. But moving on, producing electricity locally is a good way to ensure your city's needs are met while saving on costs that importing power would bring. The different power plants can be divided into different categories based on what type of resource they use to produce electricity: fossil fuels, renewable energy, and nuclear. Fossil fuel power plants use coal, oil, or gas to produce electricity, which can be produced locally in specialized industry areas. ore and oil, or imported from outside connections. Power plants using renewable resources get their energy from solar, wind, geothermal, and water. So it mentions here that you can produce electricity from specialized industry areas, and in parentheses, it shows ore and oil here. So this sounds like the Industries DLC function from Cities Skylines 1 is going to be built into the base game in Cities Skylines 2. So you're still going to have those same industry areas you had before, ore and oil, but they're built into the function of the game, not some DLC that you need to add that in. So that's quite cool. The demand for electricity increases as the city grows, but it is also affected by changes in the temperature, with both hot and cold weather increasing consumption. On hot days, the city needs air conditioning to cool down. When it's cold outside, heating increases the amount of electricity used. Consumption is at its lowest when the weather is neither too hot nor too cold. That makes sense. So moving on to transformers, which is quite new here. So in Cities Skylines 2, there are two types of electricity, low voltage and high voltage. Electric cables are used to transfer low voltage electricity used by the buildings of the city and can be manually placed above ground or underground. Most of the road types include built-in low voltage cabling, automatically connecting buildings along the road to the electric grid. Electric cables have a low electricity capacity, meaning they alone cannot transfer all the electricity produced by the large power plants, which is where high voltage comes into play. Power lines are used to transfer the high voltage electricity produced by power plants, and they have higher electricity capacity, which enables them to transfer large amounts of electricity. They are also used to import or export electricity from neighboring cities through outside connections. Power lines can be manually placed above ground or underground, and they can be connected to low voltage electric cables and roads with a transformer station. Here, high voltage electricity is transformed into low voltage electricity that can be used by the buildings of the city, but it can also transform low voltage electricity to high voltage for export. A transformer station can have multiple power line connections and multiple electric cables connected to it, but it has a limited capacity for how much electricity can be transformed in total. And here we get our first image of the dev diary finally, saying transform high voltage to low voltage or vice versa with a transformer station. So this very clearly is one of the transformer stations. Very good looking asset, looks very realistic. Nice. Couple little pedestrians, which I quite like to see, walking around in some realistic clothing, unlike in the first game. I quite like that. So yeah, everything looks pretty good here. And of course we do have the power cables back here as well, transmitting from the transformer onward. And next we're talking about emergency battery stations. So an emergency battery station stores electricity by charging the batteries when the city's electricity production is higher than its consumption, allowing the stored electricity to be used to avoid blackouts if consumption spikes. When there's a lack of electricity in the city, the emergency battery station starts discharging the batteries. The batteries can be used in conjunction with the solar power plant to power the city during the night when the solar power plant doesn't produce electricity. Prepare for spikes in electricity consumption with an emergency battery station. So here, this is our first look at the emergency battery station, but it makes a lot of sense what it's offering. So especially for solar, just as it had mentioned, if you have some solar panels, soaking up the sun and producing electricity all throughout the day, well, where is all that solar power coming from at night when there's no sun in the sky? Of course, you're going to have some way to store that to power the city throughout, especially if solar is what you are largely depending on to power the city. And then we are going to get into wind turbines. A wind turbine is the cheapest renewable energy source to build, but it has a comparatively low output. It generates low voltage electricity from wind currents, and its power output depends on its placement on the terrain. When placing a wind turbine, there will be a notification telling you how much electricity would be produced in the current spot. A wind turbine can be placed roadside, on the ground, or on water. If placed elsewhere but roadside, it needs to be connected with an electric cable to the electricity grid. It is a good choice for small cities and windy locations. Go green and power your city with wind turbines if the wind is strong enough. So what it's set up here is exactly in line with what we had in the first game, right? So any of us who has played Cities Skylines, the original, and used wind turbines for energy know that it does have a pretty low output. And it does depend on the placement of the terrain. There are certain areas, even in the first game, where you would generate more wind, and it would give you the same notification, it sounds like, telling you how much electricity would be produced in that spot before you place it. So although they are, they do have a very low output, they are very useful, and you know what you're going to get out of them before you place them, so you can make that decision on how cost effective they are based on that. And here we get our first look at the wind turbines, and really good looking. Again, looks a little better than they did in the first game, and especially with that backdrop, the city back there just looks really nice. And it is confirmed that these can be built in the water. So if you all recall, we had the advanced wind turbines, I believe, were the only ones that could be built in the water, but the basic wind turbines could not. So it's nice to see that these can be built wherever we want them. Moving on to the small coal power plant. A basic power plant that is cheap to build, affordable to maintain, and available in the early game, but also one that generates a large amount of pollution and requires coal as fuel to produce electricity. Unlike many of the other power plants, the small coal power plant cannot be upgraded. And it says here, the small coal power plant is a cheap option for a small town looking to produce electricity locally. So it says it cannot be upgraded. Cool, looks good, and even though it says small, looks like it's probably bigger than what we had in the first game. So small comparative to, I guess, we're about to see in a minute, there's a larger version of this. But compared to the first game, doesn't really look too small at all. And then we move on to the gas power plant. So the gas power plant is larger and more efficient than coal power plants, and it is fueled by natural gas. Gas can be produced in the city using specialized industry areas to extract oil and refine it into petrochemicals used by the power plant. It's a slightly less cost-effective way to produce electricity, but it produces a bit less pollution than coal power plants. Yeah, so that is a good bit bigger, and again, very good looking asset. No surprise there. That seems to be the theme with these, which I'm quite happy with. And then we have the coal power plant. Remember, just up here we had the small coal power plant. Now we're getting into the just coal power plant, so much larger. That looks more about the size of the gas power plant and much larger than the small coal power plant. So I guess the names make sense. So the coal power plant has all the same features of the small one, but everything is bigger, of course. When the city grows and the electricity consumption increases, the small coal power plant's electricity production is no longer enough, and you'll need to expand your production. That's where the coal power plant shines, as its electricity production is significantly larger and it is cheaper to build and maintain one coal power plant than the amount of small coal power plants that are required to get the same output. Cool. Then we get into geothermal power plants. As a renewable energy source, the geothermal power plant converts heat from deep underground, turning it into electricity. The power plant doesn't need fuel to operate, but it requires groundwater deposits to function, and it doesn't create as much pollution as coal power plants. The downsides of this power plant are that it is somewhat expensive to build and maintain, and it also pollutes the groundwater deposit, making it unusable for drinking water. Cool. And again, huge, massive, massive thing. And then we get into solar power plants. So the solar power plant is another source of renewable energy, which converts sunlight into electricity. However, its output depends on the time of day and the latitude of the map. So I do quite like that. I think not only the time of day and, whether it's day versus night is kind of all that really mattered in the original game. The latitude of the map is going to matter. So, some maps it might not really be all that effective to even use solar as an energy option, or at least as your primary energy source. Whereas on other maps, it might be the complete opposite. But moving on, as this power plant requires sunlight to function, it does not produce electricity during the night, of course, but has a small integrated battery that can release some of the charged electricity at nighttime. Cool, so it does have sort of one of those backup battery stores built into it, it sounds like. And then, of course, we can build the other ones if we need extra, as we talked about earlier. This plant only produces noise pollution, making it a green option. However, it is expensive to build and maintain, and as the power output depends on the weather, the production of electricity isn't stable. That makes sense, and we saw this the other day in the video. Huge thing here with what's, again, got to be over like 100 solar panels. I'm not going to sit here and count them, but that's quite a lot. I asked this in the video the other day, and I kind of want to ask it again. I don't know if, the asset right off the bat is this huge, or if this is an upgraded version, because it did mention earlier the only power plant, I believe it said, that could not be upgraded was the small coal power plant, and that's because you have the larger version that you can just build, which I guess might have its own upgrades for that matter. But anyway, I'm guessing this is an upgraded version of a solar farm where, you wouldn't lay this beast down in the early stages of a city. That's quite huge. But I really like the look of it. And next we have nuclear power. So a thermal power plant that uses nuclear fission as the source of heat. This power plant produces huge amounts of electricity, and it doesn't use any type of fuel to operate. The only pollution it produces is high noise pollution, which makes it sound almost too good to be true. But of course, there are some downsides. It is very expensive to build, has a high upkeep cost, and consumes large amounts of water for cooling. So make sure your water supply and your economy are in good shape before adding the nuclear power plant to your city. And here it reiterates it may be expensive, but the nuclear power plant produces a lot of electricity and doesn't pollute the ground or the air. And again, massive, massive thing. Very good looking, but you definitely want to keep that away from your residences because it is crazy loud, even though it doesn't pollute. And lastly, we're going to talk about the hydroelectric power plant. So these generate electricity from flowing water and offer a renewable source of energy that only produces noise pollution, yet again. Its output depends on the speed of the water flowing through its turbines, and how stable its electricity generation is depends entirely on the water simulation. Flowing water, such as rapid rivers with steep elevation differences, are great spots to build dams. The size of the dam determines both its cost and electricity production. And here it says to take advantage of the rivers on the map with a hydroelectric power plant. And again, huge, humongous thing. Of course, it said you can, build it whatever size you need it to be. So I'm sure there'll be some certain maps where this will be super, super effective, and others where it probably won't be worth the time to take to build one. But they look really good. So I hope I can fit it into some of my cities for sure. And next we're going to get into fuel logistics. Fuel for power plants can be extracted locally using specialized industry areas, or it can be imported from outside connections, each with both benefits and downsides. Local fuel extraction will generate less truck traffic between the city and outside connections. However, producing different fuel types locally is quite pollutive, and it takes up a lot of space. That makes sense and sounds like a pretty fair trade-off. If the fuel is imported from outside connections, there won't be pollution from specialized industry areas in the city, but there will be more traffic between the power plants and outside connections. In the long run, it is more expensive to buy fuel instead of producing it yourself. So again, that also makes sense. It's always going to be more expensive to export anything than produce it locally. That's just how logistics work in general. You have to pay for the service, you have to pay for the travel, the transportation, so it makes sense. And goes on to say that in both cases, it is important that the road network is built to handle the transportation between the fuel production or outside connection and the city's power plants. Fuel shortages can occur if trucks cannot make it in time to the power plants before they run out of fuel. And of course, fuel costs are added to the power plant's upkeep cost. And then we get our first look at power plant upgrades, which I'm quite interested to see here. So it said in the previous development diary, we discussed how building upgrades can add or expand existing functionalities of service buildings. Yep. They cost money to build, and in most cases, they also increase the building's upkeep cost. Most of the electricity service buildings have upgrades to modify their functionality through these types of upgrades: operational, extensions, and sub-buildings, which we all went over last week. The upgrades affect various aspects, such as the building's capacity, output, and the amount of pollution the building is producing. For example, the gas power plant has 4 different upgrades: a storage extension, an advanced furnace, an exhaust filter, and an additional turbine. The storage extension allows the plant to store more fuel, resulting in it needing fewer deliveries, and as it is a sub-building, you can build multiple extensions if needed. The advanced furnace is an operational upgrade that reduces the fuel consumption of the plant, while the exhaust filter reduces the building's air pollution. An additional turbine provides an extension upgrade that allows the plant to produce more electricity, though it also increases both its fuel consumption and pollution output. Cool. Multiple upgrades give you more tools to design the city you want. Some upgrades take up more space and increase the upkeep cost, so it's up to you to decide which upgrades fit the building's use and the city's current needs. If the building is far from residential areas and downwind, it is not crucial to reduce the pollution of the building, while it may be beneficial if the air pollution is affecting citizens. The building's location and connections to the electricity network determine the usage of the building, and if the usage is low, upgrades that improve capacity and productivity may not be needed just yet. However, excess electricity can always be traded to outside connections if the situation arises. The city's electricity usage can also be increased by lowering the electricity fee, as this causes the citizens to use more electricity per household, while also increasing their happiness and the efficiency of companies. And here we get another look at the coal power plant. Says the coal power plant fully upgraded with an additional turbine, advanced furnace, exhaust filter, and an additional coal storage yard. So that's quite cool. Yes, this looks like our coal storage yard, of course. Cool. And then we're going to look at electricity distribution. So as mentioned, electricity is no longer a matter of connecting electric zones created by buildings, but instead providing your city with a robust power grid. Power plants and transformer stations feed electricity directly into the grid through electric cables, and these can be connected through the high voltage power lines. Each power line in the electric cable has a maximum capacity which determines how much electricity they can carry. When that capacity is reached, a bottleneck forms, creating a disturbance in the distribution of electricity. Every building is connected to the electric grid automatically when they are built or zoned alongside roads, while buildings not placed roadside need to be connected manually. So this makes sense, and it works similar to the way it was in Cities Skylines originally. It sounds like a little bit improved and more realistic. So instead of just having that magic blue sort of bubble forming around buildings that would just kind of grow and spread, you actually have the lines here, right, connecting to each building, running under the roads. So essentially it will just transfer across the space as you're building, but in a little bit more of a realistic way than, again, that weird magical blue bubble. And here it tells us that power is distributed through electricity cables under roads, and buildings are automatically connected when built next to roads. So just like we were talking about and just like we just read, going to spread pretty naturally. You know, all the roads are already going to have these connections. As buildings pop up, they're going to connect automatically. So again, similar to that magical blue bubble we had, but just in a more realistic way that makes a little more sense. And next, talking about electricity bottlenecks. These occur when an area of the city requires more electricity than the grid can currently distribute. This results in buildings in that area losing power, as the electric grid cannot support all of them. And this happens when an area in question only has a few connections to the rest of the city's power grid. Electricity bottlenecks form when a power line or electricity cable reaches its limit. So it looks like if you do experience one of these bottlenecks, you will get this little pop-up here that'll explain to you that that's what's happening, and I'm guessing you can just, throw in some lines or transformers wherever you need to improve that. That's something we'll have to learn by playing, I think, to make the most sense of balancing that out. The solution is simple. Provide the area with more electricity connections so more power can be distributed to it. Well, fair enough. You can build more roads or low voltage connections using electric cables, or you can use transformer stations and power lines to circumvent the bottleneck area entirely. Placing a transformer station on the other side of the bottleneck where electricity can be distributed through multiple routes and then connecting it with a power line directly to the power plant allows additional electricity to be distributed into the area beyond the bottleneck. Cool. Yeah, so a bunch of ways you can kind of manage that by just balancing out the electricity distribution however you need to. Shouldn't be too difficult of a thing to manage in the game, though I could see this little guy popping up here and there and having to be dealt with for sure. And the last thing in electricity, it looks like, before we get to water, is the electricity info view. So it includes illustrative and relevant information about the electricity grid of the city, giving you a quick overview. You can see both the city's current consumption and how much electricity is produced by the power plants with the electricity availability meter, while the electricity trade meter shows if any electricity is imported from or exported to outside connections. And the battery charge meter shows the amount of electricity currently stored in the batteries of your power plants and emergency battery stations. So that is talking about the electricity trade meter, electricity availability. So we see here, we are producing more than we need. We're not currently exporting any, and we do not currently have anything stored in a battery charge. But this is how those will look in game, at least. The info view includes many visual elements, such as the electricity flowing through low and high voltage cables, and in which direction the electricity is flowing. Hovering over the power lines and electric cables with the mouse cursor shows how much electricity is transmitted and the maximum capacity of the power lines and cables. The buildings that consume electricity are shown in different tones of yellow and orange based on how high their consumption is, while power plants, transformers, and batteries are highlighted in different colors. The other visual additions like wind speed arrows, groundwater deposits, and water flow arrows can be turned on and off as needed. Yeah, so it sounds like the info view is going to give you so much information that you might even want to turn some of it off, which I appreciate. I'd like to have more information at my fingertips than not enough, which was something we kind of experienced in the first Cities Skylines game, right? Like, I remember one thing. The only thing I ever really had consistent trouble with was businesses not having enough goods to sell. And it never told you why. It never told you if it was a traffic problem, if things were being imported too slowly or being imported too much to begin with and you needed to produce more within the city. It never really told you why. So you had to just kind of play with it until you figured it out, and it was so annoying and would usually get much worse before it got any better. And just, yeah, might even take a couple hours in some situations to get it figured out, and it just really took away from the gameplay experience. So having more information telling me exactly what is wrong and why, so I can actually get in there and fix it and get back to playing and enjoying myself, then the better. Cool. And next we will be talking about water sources. So to start, there are two types of water sources in Cities Skylines 2. Surface water is familiar to the previous game and includes dynamic, flowing rivers, lakes, and vast oceans. Groundwater, however, is an entirely new feature and expands the possibilities of water and sewage gameplay. So starting with surface water, open dynamic water areas are a trademark of the Cities Skylines franchise. They are present on every map in the game in the form of rivers, lakes, or oceans, and depending on the map, they all feature water flow of different strengths. Lakes and oceans tend to have minimal flow, while rivers carry large amounts of water from their sources to river deltas at the shores of lakes and oceans. Water flow is an integral part of the surface water gameplay as it determines how water is obtained and where the polluted sewage from sewage outlets ends up. Surface water is susceptible to water pollution, so it is important to plan the placement of both the water pumping station and sewage outlet to avoid contaminating your water supply. Inspecting the water info view and its surface water flow overlay gives you information about the direction and strength of the water flow on the map. So we have looks like a picture of the info view here saying watch the water flow when placing sewage outlets or water pumping stations. So having a look at this. Okay, so it gives us an idea of the water availability, our water trades. This is similar to the electricity trade we were looking at previously, where if we produce too much, we can export. Looks like we're importing in this case. Also manages the sewage treatment and sewage export. So it looks like there is a lot of detail involved here, and looking over here at kind of the main side menu, there are a ton of little menus and info views that we'll need to reference in the game, which similar to Cities Skylines 1, but looks like it might be a little more, so hopefully it's not super hard to navigate, especially for us console players who are going to be doing it with a controller rather than a keyboard and mouse. So we'll just have to wait and see when that comes. And then getting into groundwater. Groundwater is a brand new feature in Cities Skylines 2. Like surface water areas, groundwater is featured on every map, and the groundwater deposits are accessible through the groundwater pumping station. So that's cool. So we do have it confirmed that groundwater deposits will be available in every single map. Of course, they're going to be, more easily accessible than others, probably closer to the starting tiles than others, depending on the map, but very cool to know that it will be available on every map in some way. But getting back to the article, the groundwater deposits have a replenishment rate which refills their water level over time. However, unlike surface water areas, groundwater deposits can temporarily dry up if their usage is higher than their replenishment rate. The deposits will eventually fill back up if water pumping is halted or reduced by lowering the budget and thereby the building's efficiency. Groundwater deposits can be found throughout the map, so this gives us an idea, I guess, when we have our water info view up and we're looking for water sources on the map, or groundwater sources specifically, I should say. It's going to show up in this blue, very water-like color here. So should be easy to spot, and very similar to the first game where we would look for industry areas maybe, and they would show up in different colors on the map when we had this particular info view open, the specific info view open for industry areas. So should be easy to find, navigate, and again, depending on the map, might be a little more easily accessible or more useful or ideal to prioritize over open water sources, all dependent completely on the map. So it'll be interesting to, compare the different maps and see just exactly how the water services need to be managed, depending on where you start, the climate, and all that good stuff. Goes on to say that groundwater deposits are very susceptible to ground pollution. If the deposit comes into contact with ground pollution, it starts to become contaminated, leading to dirty water being pumped back into the water system. So, of course, that is realistic, makes total sense, no real surprises there. Once the ground pollution is removed, the pollution in the groundwater deposit also decreases until it is entirely clean once again. The rate at which the deposit is decontaminated is the same as its water replenishment rate. So that kind of makes sense as well. Of course, usually if groundwater is polluted, I imagine in real life it's kind of a generational thing. It's not just going to replenish super quickly. But then again, don't know what the replenishment rate is for the groundwater itself. But it does say that it's going to match whatever that is. So we'll just have to see when the game comes out kind of how much sense that makes. But generally, it's a pretty cool function, I think. And here it just says pollution spreads to an entire deposit once it comes into contact with polluted ground. So yeah, as soon as something gets into that groundwater, all of it is contaminated and is basically no longer usable until that replenishment rate sorts it out and it's become decontaminated. And again, we have our little info view here, kind of the same as we were looking at before, but it does show us that groundwater sort of changes colors to let you know, hey, no bueno. And as the last little piece here on groundwater, says groundwater usage is an equally viable way to bring water to the city and a great alternative to water pumping stations when a map features a limited amount of surface water areas. Additionally, geothermal power plants require groundwater deposits to produce electricity in the city. Cool. And then we get into water production and sewage, and I think we're getting pretty close to the end of the dev diary here now. Alright, so clean water is a crucial resource in a functioning city, and in general, the city produces as much sewage as the amount of water it consumes. Buildings require water to perform their basic functions, and citizens require it to be able to live in the city. Water can be pumped from surface water areas as well as from groundwater deposits located underground. So kind of just reiterating stuff we've already been talking about. But it goes on to say sewage treatment is equally important for the city and its citizens, as insufficient sewage infrastructure causes used, dirty water to back up in the pipes, flooding apartments and causing citizens to become sick and negatively affecting businesses' efficiency. So pipes. Water infrastructure is built into most of the road types, similar to electric cables, though pipes do not have a capacity to keep an eye on. Cool. So you don't have to, manage it like you have to manage the high voltage versus low voltage for electricity. Both water and sewage pipes are automatically connected to all the buildings constructed alongside roads. Buildings that don't require road access can be connected with separate underground pipes, either single pipes for water or sewage, and as a combined water-sewage dual pipe. Pipes are built using similar tools to roads and can be replaced with different types if needed. Water and sewage connections happen automatically for roadside buildings, it says, so it shows us that, We have the, I'm imagining, yeah, the water pipes are in blue. The sewage pipes are here in yellow. And then this shows us, for, again, any buildings that aren't built on the road that don't automatically have these connections, these are the different types of pipes that we can manage. So this is the combined pipe that does both. This will be sewage, this will be water. Cool stuff. And then we're looking at the water pumping station, which pumps water from surface water areas such as lakes, rivers, and the ocean. It is placed on the shoreline and has a stable output of water unless the water level drops significantly. So this is exactly the same as Cities Skylines 1. Nothing really noteworthy there. It says to supply your city with water from lakes or rivers using the water pumping station. So we'll have a look at that. Again, don't really like this little JPEG looking water droplet icon. Not the best looking thing. But the asset in general looks a lot better than it did in Cities Skylines 1. So I don't know if that's something that's going to be ironed out or if that's just, you know, what the logo is going to be, I guess. But either way, big improvement, so happy enough. And then we're looking at water towers, which, again, already I will mention look a lot better than they did in Cities 1. But it says the water tower is able to provide a limited amount of water while placed anywhere on the map and isn't affected by any type of pollution. However, its biggest downside is that it is very costly to maintain compared to the other water facilities. And it says water towers can be placed anywhere but can only provide a limited supply of water. So when they say it can be placed anywhere, do they mean literally anywhere? I thought they had to have access to groundwater, but maybe not, because next we're going to be talking about the groundwater pumping station. So I don't know. That part's a little bit unclear. I mean, it literally says anywhere, which was the case in Cities 1, but I thought that was going to be different in Cities 2 based on the video that we watched the other day. So that part still a little unclear on whether that is the case. Anyway, we'll have a look at the water tower, and again, looks really nice, as well as these buildings here. Very good shot in general, actually. Look at all of those trees. It's just so much nicer than the last game. So nice to see all that vegetation. Moving on to groundwater pumping station. Maps have underground water reservoirs, and the groundwater pumping station is able to access these. It needs to be placed on top of a groundwater deposit to pump water up from underground, supplying your city with water. Groundwater is a good alternative on maps that have limited surface water areas where dealing with sewage is more challenging. And it reiterates here, place a groundwater pumping station on a groundwater deposit to supply your city with water. So looking at this is going to be a groundwater pumping station. It does specify in the details here that you will have to place it on a groundwater deposit. So going back to the water tower where it says it can be placed anywhere, I guess that is confirmation that it does not need to be built on a groundwater deposit. But I don't know. There's no way to be 100% sure. I'd like to know what you all think. But moving on, next we will talk about the advanced water pumping station. The advanced water pumping station is a unique building with a high output of water. Similar to the regular water pumping station, it is placed on the shoreline. However, its water pumping rate is tenfold compared to the other pumping stations, making it a much more cost-effective option for a large city. So yeah, this beast here is going to be 10 times as strong as the standard water pumping station. When your city's need for water increases, the advanced water pumping station provides a great option for clean water. And again, very good looking asset this. I like how it's kind of built out onto the water as well. But again, looking at the logos, just another, I have to gripe about it once more. The logo, you know, it looks really good here, but then you have that weird little white background on some of the icons on the sides of the building that just don't look as good. So I don't know why they chose that or what, but kind of not loving it. but loving everything else, so it's all right. And then we move on to the sewage outlet, which pumps dirty water directly back into surface water areas. It is built on the shoreline and connected to the city through a sewage pipe. The sewage outlet doesn't have a treatment functionality, so the output is 100% contaminated water, though this can be reduced to a degree through its upgrades. It is important to plan the placement of sewage outlets so they do not contaminate areas of the water where the city pumps up clean water. Sewage outlet is cheap and efficient, but lets out much pollution. So this is exactly the same as Cities Skylines 1. You obviously don't want to contaminate any water you are consuming, so you want to be careful where you set these sewage pipes. But it does say there are upgrades available, which will allow it to contaminate less, I suppose. I imagine it's still going to be pretty massive, so for the most part, going to probably be using water treatment plants. But it's good to know that this is an option, and oh god, that is just terrible and disgusting. You can see, oh, it's just like throwing out chunks of sewage, and oh, that's absolutely terrible. I will, if I don't have to, I am not going to be using these things. That is god awful. We will move right on from that because that is terrible. And here we are. This is much better. So we get to the wastewater treatment plant, which processes sewage, purifying it so it can be reused as clean water for the city. That is more like what I'm going for. Pollutants are removed from the water and turned into solid waste, which is then collected by garbage trucks and transported to one of the city's waste management facilities. Treat your wastewater inland with the wastewater treatment plant and avoid polluting your lakes or rivers. Now that is how we want to handle our sewage, I think, at least me personally. And it's a really good looking asset as well. Super good looking. Again, stupid little logo, but whatever. Everything else looks super good. If that's the only thing I have to complain about, then I will count my blessings. And then I think the last two things we're talking about here, yeah, this will be it. The last two things we're going to talk about are the water facility upgrades and water and sewage info view. So starting with water facility upgrades. Like other city services, the upgrades for water facilities include operational upgrades, building extensions, and sub-buildings. These upgrades add capacity and new functionality to the buildings, increasing freshwater and sewage output, as well as adding water treatment capabilities for both water pumps and sewage facilities to help you combat pollution. I really like this upgrade system here. So instead of just dropping 20 water pumping stations, along a river like you'd sometimes need to do in Cities 1, having these different options for extending the buildings you already have, adding sub-buildings, and doing operational upgrades, it's going to make a really big difference, I think, in how the city actually looks. Instead of having 20 pumping stations, maybe you have 4 or 5, and they all have different sort of add-ons and whatnot to kind of keep the aesthetic looking nice rather than just, again, looking ridiculous with 20 pumping stations side by side, just looking a bit nonsensical. But getting back into it, as an example of operational upgrades, the groundwater pumping station can be upgraded with an advanced filtering system, reducing pollutants in intake water. And the sewage outlet can benefit from chemical purification to reduce its water pollution. Both the water pumping station and the groundwater pumping station can increase their water intake through extensions, and the wastewater treatment plant can increase its processing capacity through 1 or more extra processing unit sub-building upgrades. Again, really appreciate that upgrade mechanic. I think it's going to make such a difference. But as it states here, we are getting to the last item on our list today, which is water and sewage info view. It highlights the location of both water and sewage service buildings and provides informative elements that are not otherwise visible. Similar to the electricity info view, you have the water availability meter, which shows the city's current water consumption and production, serving as a quick overview of your city's water needs. You can also keep an eye on water trade to see how much water is imported from or exported to outside connections. And sewage, of course, has its own 2 meters bringing you all the information you need to determine how well your sewage system is holding up. Under the meters is a selection of different visual elements which can be enabled or disabled on the info view. For example, water and sewage pipes, shown in blue and yellow respectively, also display which way the water is moving in the pipe network. The polluted water and polluted groundwater deposits are colorful and easy to notice in the info view, and the arrows help to illustrate which direction the water is flowing. So that is exactly the same as Cities 1. The arrows, easy to follow to know which way the water is flowing. So you're not going to be pumping sewage up here and letting it run downstream to your water pumping station here, where you're sucking it back in through those water pumping stations and essentially obliterating your entire city. So yeah, easy peasy, but we'll open that up. First it says check water flow, groundwater deposits, water pollution, and more with the water and sewage info view. So yeah, same as all the other info views that we've been looking at. You've got your availability. It shows the trade as it mentioned. So right now we're importing. We have the option to export. If we're bringing in too much, we can sell it and offset some of the cost. Same thing with sewage. And of course, this shows us the levels of pollution, the water flow, all that good stuff. So pretty standard menu, easy to follow. As this brings us to the end of the video, what are you all thinking about electricity and water services in Cities Skylines 2? It's definitely one of the least exciting parts of the game that we've covered so far, but power and water are going to be a foundation for any cities we build, so it's still definitely good to know. On a much more exciting note, however, next week we'll be getting maps and themes, which is for sure one of the dev diaries I've been waiting for and looking forward to the most. So be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for that. And lastly, if you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate you hanging out with me today and want to encourage you to consider subscribing if you haven't already and hitting that like button if you enjoyed today's video or found it informative. And of course, if you didn't enjoy the video, feel free to leave a dislike as well. But with all that said, I want to thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day.